Welcome to In Defense of Freedom, the podcast by the California Constitutional Rights Foundation, dedicated to championing civil liberties and justice. Join us in our mission by supporting our work and this podcast at www.cacrf.org. Together, we can make a difference. Today, we've got as our guest a very interesting individual, Daniel Goodwyn. Daniel was back in Washington on January 6th, 2021, at the riot at the Capitol. We are fortunate to have Daniel today. I'm looking forward to hearing your story of what happened. Having represented a client back in Washington during the trials or the persecutions, however you want to describe them, I'm pretty familiar with, what happened, and nothing ever started on January 6th. There was a history to this. And Daniel, why don't you tell me your story as to how you ended up in Washington and then what subsequently happened to you?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. First off, before I go into my story, I would say I actually wasn't at a riot on January 6th. And that's not to say that a riot didn't happen. There was a small area during a certain time period that the police instigated a riot, and I just wasn't there for that. I missed out on the fun. So anyways, not completely fun. Because obviously the cops killed a few people that day, which people don't talk about. But yeah, I'll back up to, I guess, a little bit before January 6th.
Yeah. How'd you even get to Washington to start with, and why?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Christian, and this really is everything I do in my life is really emanating from my faith. So before January 6th, I got into activism initially through pro-life activism, and I also like to share the gospel. And so I got into free speech activism because I started noticing that people were getting banned online, and you can't really do any advocacy if you can't speak. The online area is a pretty big area in the public arena. So that was kind of the second area I got into. Then, we had all these lockdowns, so I got into medical freedom, but we started noticing the election integrity issue really being pretty serious. So I started going to the Stop the Steal rallies. I went to one in Sacramento. I went to Phoenix and Arizona. I forget which was first. I also went to another one in DC. And then eventually to the January 6th rally. Trump had put out a tweet saying to be there. So as the commander in chief, I figured I should follow what he says as a U.S. citizen. And, I wanted to be there to get video and, if there was any Antifa, capture that because they had been attacking. For example, they were attacking in Sacramento. And, just to show the size of the crowds, because Trump had been always talking about how the news wouldn't show how big the crowds were. And I've never seen so many people in my life. I think there probably was a million people or more. And so that's the short answer of how I got into activism and got to be there on January 6th.
Okay. So back on these Stop the Steal rallies, were you requested to go to Washington at those rallies, or was it just the tweet by the president?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So Ali Alexander really spearheaded the Stop the Steal movement, and he had kind of coordinated with people from the swing states, you could say, or, the places with the most fraud. And he said, basically, the day that the election was stolen, he said, you know what, we need to go to every state capital every week. And so we did that. So I was in California. So first I went to Sacramento, but, we also planned to go to DC. We went once per month. So once in November, once in December, once in January. I missed the December one, but yeah, so that was kind of a dual thing. And then Trump started talking about it. So really, Ali Alexander had started the plan and getting it in motion. And then Donald Trump kind of latched onto the permanent events that were already slated to be there in DC on January 6th, which includes the Capitol, on the Capitol grounds in Lot 8, for example, and other places as well.
Okay. So tell us how you won, maybe how you got to Washington. Did you go with other people, or was it just a jump on an airplane and fly back there?
Yes and no. So I'll back up slightly. I've actually been arrested 4 times. So one time was in San Francisco for not wearing a mask on a bus. And they dropped those charges as, there's one reason probably is that there's no law about that. But number 2, We have Chesa Boudin is kind of a Soros type DA, and I think he just gets a stack and just dismisses them all because he wants criminals on the streets. Probably if he knew that mine was for being right wing, he wouldn't have done it for me. But anyways, so I got off on that one. I also got arrested for being at Stop the Steal in Atlanta, and I got time served after like 4 days. I don't even know what the charge was, being a Trump supporter or something. And then I got arrested a third time on the way to January 6th. So right after New Year's, I got ready to come to DC and take a road trip because I didn't want to be bothered about masks on an airplane, which I've been hearing about people having issues. And, as you can see, I just got arrested for that. Well, guess what? I still get arrested for not wearing a mask at a gas station Taco Bell in Wyoming. So I get out for that a few days later, and I just barely get into DC on time. Now, I had planned with David Sumrall, who I was working for at the time, working for right now as well, to meet at the Washington Monument before everything so we could do a little prayer time and a photo op. But by the time I had got there, again, for one reason, because I was a little late, but also the crowds were so immense. And whether it's just that the cell towers couldn't handle that amount of people, or maybe it was because they were being intercepted by the authorities, the service wasn't great, so I wasn't actually even able to meet up with them there, but I made it to the rally itself, and I don't remember if I actually heard at the time when Trump said, we're going to peacefully and patriotically make our voices heard, we're going to be going to the Capitol building, but I had already known that we were going to go to the Capitol, so at one point I made it down to the Capitol, and by the time I made it into the building, it was about 3:33 p.m.
So you really did miss all the fun.
I did, yes.
All the fun was taking place at 2:30.
Well, you could say that. At 1:07, Josh Black gets shot in the face by the snipers, right? So then there's blood all over the ground. And there's so much to know about January 6th. Even many defendants don't realize, I was on the east side and this was happening on the west, or vice versa. Or, I was here at this time, but later at that time, and everything that happened in the tunnel. But because of that, I actually decided mainly David decided, we really wanted to document this stuff. So, I did get footage myself that day. Some other people on our team did. And then people we knew, and then just people online, we started putting that footage together, and we put out a documentary about January 6th every year since it happened. So the first one was in June of 2021, when it was not popular to talk about January 6th, especially in a truthful or positive way. So put that message out there and showed, actually, you know what? We didn't kill any cops that day. The cops killed us. And then, we put out one the next year, and then the next year. So Writing History, Bloody Hill, 1,000 Days of Terror. And then the last one we did was January 6th, A True Timeline. And Tucker Carlson said it should be the most famous movie in the country.
So when did you put out The True Timeline?
That was New Year's last year.
New Year's of 2024.
Right.
Okay.
And we've got another one coming out any minute now. So be on the lookout for that one.
Okay. And what's the name of that?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the name yet.
Oh, that's too bad, because I wanted to publicize it.
Yeah, I'll have to ask.
The reason I'm so interested in this, and particularly that timeline, because I watched that documentary and It's spot on.
Thank you.
Being a defense attorney in one of the cases back in Washington with a January 6th defendant, I was privy to literally thousands of hours of video, mostly seized from participants that were there, that the feds used in their trials. And so a lot of that video I've watched previously as in preparation for trial. And we'll get into discussion of that. Just as you probably have some opinions of how the courts in Washington, D.C. operate, I have some very strong opinions as to what happened in those trials with defendants who really were there essentially on a road trip to go support the president. And many of them didn't really participate and ended up in prison regardless. The prosecutors didn't care who was actually guilty of attacking police. They were more interested in taking scalps.
Yeah, 100%. And even the concept of attacking police, it's a little bit of a misnomer if you know what happens. So for example, say you just watch the police kill someone right in front of you. Well, if they're wearing the right outfit, does that mean you're not allowed to defend yourself or others? I don't know if that really passes muster. Even in DC law, you have Good Samaritan law. So, that's definitely a question that people need to look at. A lot of people want to just prejudge people who assaulted officers, and a lot of the times the charges are bogus because they say assaulted officer when say the officer swings at you and you put your hand up and they're like, oh, he made contact, you assaulted an officer. There's all kinds of things like that where they'll take a still and you go and look at the video and you're like, this is not what happened. So that's one thing I want to say. But first off, so the footage itself, there's a lot of different kinds of footage, and people should know this. There's the footage that the feds get from people's phones, and all that's in discovery. Secondly, there's the footage that people posted online. So those are in similar categories. These are from the people. Then after that, you've got the CCTV. So that's from the Capitol. I guess the jurisdiction of that is somehow the Capitol Police. And then you've got the Metro Police. They all have body cams. Now, the Capitol Police don't have body cams because for some reason they are in the legislative branch and not the executive branch. You can't even FOIA information from them. So that's something people also don't realize. But yeah, you've got those basically 4 sources of footage. And people also don't realize that when you go to court, it's not just that the prosecutors are completely vindictive and dishonest. And like I said, showing things out of context. It's, and the news and Congress and their fake J6 committee. But it's also that the judges themselves will say they will preclude, or, what's the word, the legal word? They'll not let the jury see a lot of footage that could be exculpatory. And also a lot of the prosecution or the government will not give exculpatory evidence. And there's a lot of Brady violations happening.
That's right.
But then the other thing is the judge will allow the prosecution to put in prejudicial, meaning a footage that's other J6 incidents that have nothing to do with the client. And it will totally taint the jury. And the jury's like, wow, that's pretty crazy what happened. So they're seeing out of context footage of people fighting with police that aren't related to the client. And a lot of J6ers got in deep trouble because of that. And also the fact that obviously this is in Washington, D.C., a jurisdiction that's over 90% left wing. And the ones who are right wing, they're never Trump or rhinos. And they think that they are getting revenge on Trump by convicting you, even if Trump doesn't even know who you are. So it's very bogus, very unjust, and just really a travesty. So I'm so glad that he pardoned everyone. That really is the only way we could have received justice, because they should have had this. A lot of people filed change of venue motions, and none of those got through. So it's kind of bogus that the judges themselves in the D.C. District Court are the ones who decide whether or not the D.C. District is a biased area. They can't see it because they themselves are biased.
That's exactly right. They started out meeting together and deciding how they were going to decide motions that were filed. So you didn't have
that doesn't sound
every
legal.
motion.
Is that legal?
Was, they would support denying your motions by referencing another judge's denial of the same types of motions. I mean, there was nothing where judges took an independent view. This was a collective effort to send people to prison.
Wow.
And it was.
Is that allowed?
Yes, actually. Judges can meet together and talk about cases. The problem back in D.C. is that all they did was divide up the same set of facts, individuals that were plugged in to those sets of facts, and then they would meet, discuss, the general concepts. They made sure that we didn't have a chance when we walked into the court. The other thing
I think, let me just say quickly, I think that even if that's allowed, I think that improprieties did happen that we need to look into somehow, about the prosecution colluding with the judges, and even in some cases, the defense attorneys, especially those who are the public defenders. There were a few good public defenders and a bunch who J6ers say they were working against them. And with the
that's typical of public defenders, though. But
sure.
That's probably another discussion in its entirety, because public defenders have the attitude of, let's get through these cases. The facts are already determined, and I'm not going to go out and investigate it. Some of the things that really outraged me during the course was our defenses were that our clients weren't involved in the riot. We had literally hours worth of video from the various cell phones of our clients showing that there was a riot going on and there were attacks on the police. I mean, literally, bear spray against police officers. I think there's anything good about that kind of conduct. But the
Well,
flip
who
side
started it?
is,
I want to know who
just,
started it.
well, some of the video that I saw and could show you, it was obvious that it wasn't the police officer that had started it. But
I've looked through a
in
lot
that
of footage and I
particular
haven't seen
instance,
those. So I would like to see some of those because I'm actually interested to find that those
yeah,
instances.
I can,
Anything
we'll
not
get
sensitive,
together
send that
after
over.
the podcast. I'll show you some of the videos that I've got. But that begs the question, because you're president and somebody else commits a crime, doesn't mean that you committed the crime. And so the
100%.
defense is that there may have been crimes being committed, but these defendants weren't involved in that. And it was pretty evident that they weren't involved in it. I mean, we had hours of video that we were able to show to the jury. The judge in the middle of the trial says to the jury, if they're there, they're guilty. Well,
Unreal.
what do you think the juror's going to do when the judge tells them that the defendants are guilty? Then at the end of the trial, the prosecution goes from alleging that the individual defendants have committed crimes to the fact that there's, in the collective, the million people that are there are some people that have committed crimes. And so that justifies convicting these guys.
It's really incredible. And I don't think that would have happened in any other jurisdiction. Maybe a few, but probably not. This is the most corrupt thing I have ever seen or heard of in the United States of America for my entire lifetime and maybe several lifetimes before.
I've got 35 years of trying cases in both state and federal court. I have never, ever seen anything like this. I'm still sitting here in amazement that anything like this could have happened in this country.
Well, another friend of mine who went to a jury trial, I think a jury trial, maybe bench, but went to trial and got convicted. The judge actually said that he was like a raindrop in the, collective. And so he's just basically, he's guilty because he was there.
That's exactly it. And that is not the standard in the law. And I mean, we're trying to point that out. We're arguing, we're objecting to what the judge has done and allowing the prosecutors to make these arguments. The judge overrules, I feel like if you've ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny, and the judge leans down from the bench and says, hey, that was a well-reasoned argument, denied. That's what we were going through time and time again as lawyers in those cases. I couldn't believe that this was happening in the United States of America. There was no justice in that process. But I'm not being interviewed, so let me turn it back to you, Daniel.
Sure. So I guess I can talk a little bit about what I did that day. So I walked up past the Peace Monument and I actually noticed my friend Philip Anderson there. He was up there with a little megaphone. Then I walked a little bit on the grass. Now, by the time I had gotten there were fences that said, something to the effect of this is a restricted area. Those had been taken down and removed. So I didn't see anything. There was no indication that I shouldn't be there. There's obviously a huge crowd there. There was no park police on the mall directing traffic. So by the time I got there, I didn't see any police until I got up to the very building itself. There was a line of Capitol or Metro police, maybe a mix, standing there, doing nothing, not saying to anyone, this is a restricted area, you'll be arrested if you're here. And I see an open door on the west side with people meandering in and out of the door. So obviously I'm curious. I go up and I look in there. And then there's a line of police inside, and they're telling people to leave the building. So, okay. So I yell something. I say, get his badge number. I'm like, this guy's an oath breaker. And then I walk out of the building. I was inside the building for between 30 and 40 seconds, depending how you reckon the threshold there of the door. Okay. And that was my experience inside the building. I came outside. Somebody hands me a megaphone. I say, the door over here is open. You guys can go inside. We need a lot of people for this to work. And I'm thinking, a photo op. Because actually, I had gone to Stop the Steal in Atlanta. And one of the, I guess he must be state Congress or something, members had invited us in. And we all went through a metal detector. We all went in there. And we took a big photo on the steps inside the Capitol building of Georgia. And so that's kind of what I was used to. Just, you go in there, you make your voice heard, you get a photo op. And that's kind of what I thought maybe we would do. And then maybe that would put a little bit of public pressure using our First Amendment on the people who are going to decide whether or not they're going to actually make an objection to the votes. So then I get hit with this obstruction of an official proceeding. That doesn't even make any sense. I'm not trying to obstruct anything. First off, I don't know if that really even is an official proceeding. Maybe it's just, what do you call that? Not procedural, but whatever. It could, ceremonial is the word I'm looking for. Maybe it's just ceremonial, but regardless, not trying to obstruct anything. For one thing, they're already gone by the time I got there, 3:33. But, I'm actually there to support the lawful objection of Ted Cruz and Paul Gosar and whoever else signs on that said that they were going to object to these votes. So that's actually telling them to do an investigation. It's the opposite of obstructing an investigation. And we thought maybe there would be 10 days where they would go through the evidence and we'll just find out if this election was rigged or not. Well, we never found out if it was rigged or not. I'm pretty sure it was, but we never found out because they never went and looked through the evidence, right? So it's pretty bogus. But, I was thinking, some of us were planning maybe we would go camp out on the lawn for 10 days, and just have a little bit of a kind of a sit-in type thing, maybe civil disobedience. And maybe they would arrest you and you'd be out the next day, like they had done with all these BLM and Antifa people. None of us were expecting a nationwide manhunt, but they came that very month. They did a pre-dawn, Roger Stone style raid, FBI counterterrorism task force, traumatized everybody in the house. And I was just visiting my family in Texas on the way back to San Francisco. So they put us all in shackles, except for the last person out, who was my mom. They were a medieval style battering ram. They were pointing guns at us with lasers, had us all come out in the freezing cold. They were yelling, FBI, open up. And then they were really worried about COVID-19. So they had to put a mask on me. They had me handcuffed already. I've seen enough TV shows to know that you really shouldn't talk to the authorities without a lawyer present. So every time they said something to me, literally the only thing I would say is, you can talk to my lawyer. But at the same time, I wanted to get these masks off because I wanted to breathe. So what I did is I kind of used my jaw and I go like that. I get those masks off, and then they write in their police report, 2 through 5 masks. It's like, well, not exactly. Yeah, so that's what happened.
So you were, I'm certain they charged you with destruction of government property for chewing the masks.
No, they didn't do that. That would be funny though.
No, because what they wanted to do is put you in prison for 20 years by charging you with obstruction of an official proceeding, which is very charge that the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional.
So what happened is they actually, in the criminal complaint, they charged me with the 4 misdemeanors, basically trespassing, when I was locked up for 3 weeks in solitary confinement because they called it COVID quarantine lockdown, all pre-trial. They added in my indictment a 5th charge, that 1512 felony obstruction charge.
Okay.
And so that's what they did. And it was pretty wild because later they came back and said, we're going to give you a plea agreement. Plead to that 1512. I'm like, no way I'm pleading to that. I'm obviously not guilty of that. This is not an Enron era paper shredding situation. Okay. This is, I meandered into an open door and left when told. So if anything, and they actually came back and said, okay, you can plead to one of these trespassing. And I could barely plead to it because I didn't see any signs and no police told me not to go in there. The only way I could plead to it is because it said entering and remaining. So, okay, yeah, I did remain for a few seconds, but even that's pretty questionable. So I'm glad I got this pardon because, it's, if I had not had that 20-year, what do you call it, of Damocles hanging over my head? Is it a dagger? What's the expression?
Well, it's a sword,
right? The sword of Yeah, if I didn't have that over my head, I don't think I would have gone to trial and had them, try and prove those 4 misdemeanors. And I would have only been facing a year. But yeah, I took that misdemeanor. I was facing a year and they gave me a 2 months sentence that I served out. And then I had a year. And this is the crazy part, really. One of the craziest parts, a year of supervision, which included a computer monitoring restriction. So the court wanted to spy on me because they were worried I was going to spread misinformation or disinformation because I had a 5-minute segment with Tucker Carlson prior to my sentence.
So when did you enter that plea?
I would have to pull it up. I have it written down.
Yeah.
But basically I finished my year of supervision last August, which was a year after getting out of prison in August. So it would have been before that.
So basically around 22.
I guess so. I finished everything out before getting the pardon. So, well, I will say during the year of supervision, I appealed and we won. The appeals court actually ruled in our favor on this, but they said, they basically sent it back to the DC District Court and said, if you're gonna apply this or institute this computer monitoring restriction, you're gonna have to give a reason. So what the judge did is completely crazy. The DC District Court judge put in for the prosecution to put in their view on it, and then he basically copied and pasted their explanation of why he thinks that I should have computer monitoring and use that for his reasoning and reimpose the monitoring. So we appealed it a second time, and then the clock ran out, but they never ruled on it.
Okay. Yeah. My defendant went to trial in October of 23. He had been, he was fortunate enough to be arrested in the Central District of California, which is essentially Los Angeles. And the magistrates down there hadn't received apparently the talking points, and they released the 4 defendants that had been arrested essentially together. They went through exactly the same type of situation you did, with the FBI showing up 5 a.m. in the morning, flashbangs. Nobody beat at least my client's door down, but they were there with guns drawn, looking through windows, frightening the entire family, all to enter the home of an individual who, if they just knocked on the door, would have cooperated with the FBI more than I would have wanted him to.
Thank you for watching the In Defense of Freedom podcast. If you believe in the mission of defending constitutional rights and protecting individual freedoms here in California and across the country, we ask for your support. The California Constitutional Rights Foundation is doing vital work, but they can't do it alone. Your donation helps fund critical legal battles, educational programs, and advocacy efforts to preserve the liberties that matter to us all. Please consider making a contribution today by visiting cacrf.org. Every dollar makes a difference, and together we can stand strong in defense of freedom.
And in fact,
let me talk about that a little bit, because actually the lawyer I had at the time told me that he arranged with the FBI for me to self-surrender. We had a date, and they did this pre-dawn raid before I had a chance to self-surrender. So they did it on purpose, knowing that I was totally willing to do it, it just blows my mind. But then your clients, I don't know if it was your client or one of the co-defendants had one or more children that were having to be standing out in the cold during those raids. That's even worse.
That was my client. Yes.
Yeah.
I represented Ron Bailey in that trial, 4-defendant trial, which was a free-for-all. I mean, literally free-for-all. So, and they stuck him outside in the cold, and they did that literally with all the defendants. They raided all the homes at the same time. And these were 4 guys who basically got together to do a road trip to Washington, D.C. They had no intention of going back there for anything other than to support the president.
Right. Well, and support the president and support election integrity. Some people were there just for that, not even supporting the president. And some people, they really just wanted Trump there. But some people, they were just like, you know what, this looks like it's fraud, and let's look into it. We just want it looked into. That's all we want.
Well, I think, a good portion of the nation wanted them to look into it.
Yeah.
The reality is none of the deep state in Washington wanted to look into anything.
Yeah.
And
well, even the Supreme Court, Texas had asked for, with the support of, I believe, 22 states, and they never ruled on anything because they said that there wasn't standing. Well, how do you not have standing? Is Texas not a state that has a stake in who the president of the federal government is? I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course you have standing.
Yeah, yes, but from a legal standpoint, we now know they don't, and that's unfortunate. It's kind of reminiscent of how the courts treated the whole COVID situation, where they didn't want to be involved. And in the election integrity situation, the court doesn't want to be involved. They want the political side to figure this out and don't bother us. And I think that's exactly what we've seen. It got so out of control with the J6ers that finally the Supreme Court was forced, over its strenuous objection, to get involved. And striking down 1512C2 was sending messages to the political branch and the wackos in the Congress that were in charge at that point that things had better change or the court really will get involved.
Well, that was probably the biggest court victory we had for January 6th was the 1512 Supreme Court decision. But honestly, it's pretty embarrassing for Congress, I think, that they never went in and said, hey, they could have just said this is not being applied correctly. Like, it shouldn't have had to even get to the Supreme Court. The Congress could have said, this is not how 1512 is to be interpreted. You can just look at what the president said when he signed that bill. He said this shouldn't be used against free speech, basically.
Right. Well, we saw a lot of things over the last 4+ years that, are quite frankly amazing, that the system could be weaponized the way it has been weaponized. Hopefully the new leadership in Washington, Pam Bondi, when she takes over the Department of Justice, Kash Patel, when he takes over the FBI, they're going to get down to the bottom of it and clean that sewer out. Because, I've always been a strong supporter of law enforcement. That whole display of how justice was cooked up in Washington really jades you. If after 35 years you defended law enforcement and how they do their investigations, and suddenly you see people, United States citizens, that have frankly done nothing that would warrant the type of treatment they get from that group back in Washington. I mean, FBI agents sitting in trial, smirking as, it was like, an acting job when they picked up things like plate carriers, which were essentially empty, and they would drop them so that it would sound like they were really heavy and had real steel plates in it, when that wasn't true at trial. And you'd point that out based on the evidence. The judges just sort of brushed that aside, and the FBI thought it was funny.
Well, you know what? That reminds me of a couple things. And I've followed a lot of different January 6th trials, including the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys ones and the Proud Boys trial. These people had been to Washington, D.C. in November and December and been stabbed on the streets by whether it be BLM or Antifa or just thug criminals. So they actually came with cutting boards inside their their vests or whatever, because they wanted to be defensive and they wanted to be knife proof. Yet the prosecution made it seem like they were dressed up in this defensive stuff for offense against police. So not only are they wrong about offense and defense, they're wrong about the police or the Antifa or BLM that they're actually trying to defend against. And it's very obvious because it's about knives and not about guns. So it's just, if you know, but it's so easy for them to deceive people. And another one is a big one that they do is they say they were using an encrypted app to message each other.
Yeah.
And what they mean is they were texting each other on Telegram, which is an app that allows encryption, but they weren't even using the encryption feature. And people don't know this because they're not techies. These are just normal people reading the news or normal people in a jury, and they have no idea. But the FBI and the DOJ know how to make it sound really scary and like, well, what are they trying to hide? They're using encryption. It's like they're texting each other on an app like they would on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever. I mean, you could even say iMessage is encrypted. It's just completely ridiculous. What does encryption mean? Nobody knows. These people don't know. They're not techies. I know what encryption means. They don't know what encryption means.
That's right. That's right. It was...
Oh, yeah, let me also talk about a little bit more about the 1512. There was one other thing I wanted to say about it. You know what? No, I forgot what it was. So go back. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's talk a bit about how you got into this business of making these videos. Was that something that you planned on doing on January 6th, or was it something that came out afterwards?
Okay, actually, let me answer that, but let me go back. I remember what I was going to say. I think this would be interesting to you and maybe your audience. The 1512, we actually had a really good motion to dismiss that never got ruled on because the judge waited and waited and waited. And then the prosecution came in and they offered this plea deal and they had a time limit. So if the judge would have ruled on it, who knows? Maybe he would have dismissed it, maybe not. because this is the same judge who says that Trump supporters are like Nazis and Trump is like Hitler. But if he would have, dismissed that, or at least had to rule on it, that could have changed what I would have ended up doing. But I had to basically decide if I'm going to be facing left-wing DC jury with a felony, or just, facing a judge with one misdemeanor. But okay, so on January 6th, we did decide that I was gonna get footage, and we were gonna post it up on our social media, post it up online. I was thinking it would just be, take video, post it up, and that's it, and maybe put a little commentary, maybe talk about it on podcasts. But when we saw how big things were, and especially how bad the lives were, we were like, no, this has to be a documentary. And David Summerall was the one, really the force behind it, making that decision. And then we just went to work and started gathering and putting that stuff together.
Okay. And
so I had not had any documentary filmmaking experience before that. My experience was more just, short social media videos and things like that. A little bit of citizen journalism, like that.
So you put together the first one, and what was the first one?
The first one was Writing History, a journalistic battle of January 6th, and we put that out on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, which was in June of 2021.
Okay. And if somebody wanted to go look at that video and watch it, where would they go to watch it?
The easiest way to find that and the other documentaries is to go to stophate.com/J6 and then click on the documentaries tab up at the top. And we've got the 4 documentaries we worked on at the top, and then we've got a bunch of other links to other January 6th documentaries. It's just a central place to find any ones that we know about.
And that's Stop Hate or January.
Stop Hate. Yeah, stophate.com/J6. Yeah, for January.
Well, I encourage you to go, people who are watching this, to go watch those videos. I did take the time to watch one of them. I very much want to go back and watch the others now. Having lived through that as a trial attorney, I found the one I watched, which was the one called The True Timeline of January 6th, to be spot on, based on the literally thousands of hours of video that I watched in preparation for trial. And then, more video than I ever wanted to watch during the course of the trial.
Of course.
But it really does lay out what was going on January 6th. And I think it's important to know that, to the extent, as I've characterized, the riot, and Daniel has corrected me on several times, most of the people there weren't doing any rioting. They were just there. They were there, speaking their mind, and in most cases in a very peaceful way. And it's kind of incredible what happened on that day, on both sides. I mean, you just can't imagine what was going on, and what law enforcement did on that day, and how they were so ill-prepared for when they knew there were going to be 1 million people in Washington, D.C. You just can't believe that they left those, frankly, they left the officers high and dry.
Well, of course, and it was completely a setup, because Donald Trump had asked for the National Guard to be there. And Muriel Bowser's the left-wing D.C. mayor, and Nancy Pelosi were the ones who had to approve that. And they said no. Muriel Bowser put out a press release saying no. And, these people justify their decisions because of optics. Well, you know what optics they wanted was Trump supporters looking like they were bad people. And they used those optics for 4 years. So it's really ridiculous. But there was probably 1 million people at the rally, starting off at the Ellipse. They walked from the mall over to the Capitol building, and the area that they later decided was a restricted area probably had about 10,000 people in it, and they ended up arresting about 1,600, and they were going for around 3,000. They pretty much had a 1 in 3 chance that you were going to get arrested if you were in that area. And it was very arbitrary what you got charged with. More than 300, maybe around 400 people got charged with that 1512 charge. And it's just the people they don't like. It's like, for me, I had done a post on my online that said, it had a picture of the Proud Boys logo and said, "Stand back and stand by," which is a joke, obviously. They don't realize, but for me, it was a joke. And then it said, awaiting orders from our commander-in-chief. Well, what do you call it? The J6 committee, the Democrats in there, when to put that up on, and they said, this guy they try to create a nexus between the Proud Boys and Donald Trump and me. And it's like, I'm not a Proud Boy. They said I was a Proud Boy, but I'm not. But even if I was, the Proud Boys didn't do anything wrong. And so it's just really incredible what they do. It's all narrative. It's all lies. And let me just talk about those barriers. So I already said that they moved them, but why were they there? Were they there to protect the vice president or vice president-elect for the Secret Service? No, they were not there for that reason. You can go and look on the website of the Capitol Police. They said the reason they put them up was because there was inauguration scaffolding they were working on. So it's more like to the effect of if you see a sign that's like, don't go past this area unless you're wearing a hard hat. That's the vibe. Not like, don't go in here or you're going to get charged for crimes. No, it's not like that. And then here's another thing about these barriers. They had those barriers going up and down the streets nearby. And there was people walking on both sides of them. It was more like how you would see at, say, an airport or like a theme park, where it's like, this is like directing the flow of people. You're waiting in line or you're going, it's like crowd control. We weren't thinking those were up there to say this is a restricted area. No one was thinking that. The police weren't there saying that. And even the fences that had signs saying that, they were removed when most people didn't even see that was even.
That's right. People were getting up there at 2:00, 2:30. There was nothing left at that point. If it had ever existed, it was gone by the time most of the crowd got there. There is also that credible argument that the Capitol Police had no authority in the law to even set up restrictions that then they were using as a basis for saying these people were after the vice president or any other protected person.
And if it was that, then it needs to have that written. It needs to have that code written on the sign, which you see those signs. If there's a place that's protected because the Secret Service is protecting people there, they have signs that say, don't go past this area or else you'll be charged with this. And it's the code that I was charged with. None of the signs said that, and the signs weren't there when I got there anyways. But even, they didn't say it.
I found it almost laughable during the trial that I was involved in, where they had a Capitol Police officer up there trying to explain when the order had been imposed restricting the Capitol grounds because a protected person was on the grounds. And we got at least three separate answers. And the last one was, well, it was in place on January 6th. Nobody had any written orders. Nobody had anything from the Secret Service, let alone anything written down. And somebody asked in cross-examination, they had these maps showing the restricted area. And so one of the attorneys in our trial asked, well, when did this map come out? When was it published? And the person on the witness stand couldn't tell us who had published it or when. And you're going,
yeah, but it was obviously drawn up after January 6th.
It was drawn up to correspond with what they wanted the facts to be after the fact. You're exactly right.
How can we know? We're not looking at a map that you made, and you made it after the fact. It's not like they were handing those maps out to the crowd. And
That's
Trump
right.
said we're going to the Capitol. And guess what? Even those maps include some of the areas where there was permitted events. So how are you going to have a restricted area include a permitted First Amendment activity event? That doesn't make any sense because it's bogus.
It was. And, I hope that, they investigate this. I think they made some progress getting rid of those 12 prosecutors, but I think there's hundreds of others that ought to be given their severance and told to not show up anymore.
Well, absolutely. And we've got a list we're starting of prosecutors. So let's take action. I mean, these people, they need to be disbarred. They need to be fired. Really, they need to be prosecuted. If I'm being real, they need to be prosecuted because I don't know what kind of protections they have as prosecutors, federal prosecutors, but this is prosecutorial misconduct. And to me, this definitely reaches the point of this is illegal activity.
Yeah.
They at least need to be investigated,
So you guys intend then, and I use the term you guys first, who is it that is preparing all these
J6ers in general? Just J6ers. We've got a community.
Okay. So do you plan on producing additional documentaries in the future? I know you mentioned that you did them every year since.
We got one that's about to come out.
Okay. You have others in the pipeline that you're looking at?
and not that I know of. I'm sure people will want to be telling their stories, especially people who just got out, from the pardon, which is about
Right.
250, right?
I don't know the total number. I just know that my 4 guys got out.
Yeah.
Um, there's probably stories that ought to be told. There's impacts, the PTSD and the time they spent in prison. I don't know how the lawsuits are going to go in terms of wrongful imprisonment, but, the bottom line is, this was a travesty and should never have happened and should never be allowed to happen again in this country.
I totally agree. And I'm not a lawyer, but, I'm expecting, legal action here. Wrongful imprisonment is definitely something that if we're going to file things civil in the DC District Court, I don't think we can expect much if we've got these same judges. But we do have a friendly DOJ, so maybe we get settlement. Frankly, we could get executive action. The president could give us something. The Congress could. There's a bunch of rhinos in there, but they could, if they wanted, they could just make a bill to give us reparations of some sort. There's a lot of different avenues this could take, but we've got different exploratory, situations going on right now. We've got some alliances within the J6 community trying to work out what is the best course of action. But to me, I basically boil it down to 3 things. I think we need 3 things that start with an R. Number 1 being we need reparations, or you can call it restorative justice, or you can call it restitution. Number 2, we need recognition, which I think includes like there should be a national holiday and monuments having to do with especially those who died that day, killed by the police, Ashley Babbitt, Roseanne Boyland, and even Benjamin Phillips and Kevin Greason. You might say those deaths were due to the negligence of the police, if not even the grenades that were going off, especially around Kevin Greason when they said he had a heart attack. But then, the third R, after reparations and recognition for me is retribution, which means investigation and prosecution of those who did this to us. Like, we need to find out who gave orders, what was going on in terms of the deep state or law enforcement. But I totally think that it needs to include the judges and prosecutors too. They, at the very least, they need to be fired, impeached, disbarred. But I think they also need to be, prosecuted, because I think what they've done does reach the level of illegality, even with the immunity or protections that they have for the positions they have. It's just it's an unprecedented level of injustice that has to be rectified through the U.S. law.
Yeah, it's something needs to happen. I'll leave it up to the courts and not throw in my 2 cents worth today. But those of us who are either defendants or, quite frankly, the defense attorneys in the case are looking at this, and none of us can believe what had happened and how one-sided it was, and how both the prosecutors, the law enforcement agents that were involved, and the judges, along with what you described as the jury pool in Washington, D.C., they were pulling the same people for multiple trials. How do you do that? Clearly at a point in time when you've got half your jury pool that's either was actively involved downtown in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, the other part having participated in prior trials. Now, granted, in our trial, the judge, excused all those people for cause. But the fact of the matter is the jury pool then became so small that we're getting people that have already been influenced. You'd ask them where they got their news. Well, it was from the Washington Post. Well, the Washington Post had story after story after story on January 6th, most of which wasn't accurate. And so we've got a biased pool coming in. And as I think you mentioned earlier in the podcast, nobody got a venue motion granted. You got to the point where, you didn't even make the motions any longer because it was, it wasn't going to be worth it.
Right.
So
un-American. It's totally un-American.
It was. It is. And it continues to be. Well, this has been very interesting. I look forward to seeing the future documentaries that you guys put out. And I do encourage you to keep the documentaries coming, because I think when people see the destruction on families that took place after these prosecutions, people put into prison for no particular good reason, people who were up to that point, even if you believe that the convictions were warranted, Most of these people had no criminal record, had never done anything that would warrant prison, and they were put in prison for political retribution. That should never happen. And that's a lot of these families, there are divorces in them. There are kids that are screwed up. I mean, it's just to the point where you need to keep it up and keep letting the country know, because the impact doesn't end when you put somebody in prison and then let them out on a pardon. The impact continues forever for most of these families.
Yeah. And, it's more than that, because for one thing, pre-trial, a lot of people were held pre-trial for a really long time. Like some people, like even from the beginning to the end, a few of them. So that's crazy. Like 4 years with no trial.
Right.
It's just ridiculous. It's completely crazy. And you can say, oh, they waived their speedy rights trial every 2 months. Yeah, sure. Okay. But they knew they weren't going to get a fair trial. So they were trying to gather their evidence and all this, when facts of, they've got so many resources on the other side, and they've got their way to get. But anyways, these people, so the pretrial is one situation. Then you've got everyone here was overcharged, and everyone who was convicted was over sentenced. So
right.
Egregiously, like extremely egregiously, even in the fact that they got convicted, but then in the sentences themselves, it's just unbelievable. But people don't even realize it goes so far beyond what the United States government does to you. People get banned online. I got banned from not just Facebook and Instagram, which was January 8, 2021, before I was ever charged or convicted. And I also got banned from Stripe, which is a back-end payment processor. So I couldn't run a fundraiser. I had to have someone else run on my behalf. I got banned from even a dating app. I got banned from Lyft, which is like a taxi type thing.
Right.
I got banned from Airbnb. And this one's crazy. At the time, I was living in San Francisco at a house where the landlady used Airbnb for her other clients, not me. And they were going to ban her because she had a house that had the same address that I was living at. This stuff is like, you can't even believe it, right? But this,
right.
I'm banned to this day on several platforms. I made my own new Facebook in the last year, and I have made an Instagram back even more, which is just a new one. I don't have my old ones back. And somehow I've been able to stay on those. Well, guess what? 2 days ago, my Twitter account got banned. 2 weeks ago, my TikTok account got banned that I've had for a year. So I'm still getting banned on places.
Yeah, well, my client is on the domestic terror watch list, even though he's been pardoned.
Incredible.
And yeah, he lost his job. He was a sales manager. Let's assume, and he was a good sales manager, and lost his job immediately. What did going to Washington have to do with being a salesman?
Nothing.
And, lives are destroyed. I mean, he'll never, even though he has a pardon, my guess is he will never be rehabilitated in the minds of a large segment of the corporate world, to the point
almost
where they
half
would
the
hire
country.
him.
Yeah, almost half the country.
Yeah. Well, hey, this has been a really interesting conversation back and forth. I think we both have some strong opinions as to what happened on January 6th. It's been fascinating to talk to you. I encourage, again, go to it's stophate.com.
Yes.
Stophate.
/6.
Yeah. January 6th. Watch those documentaries, because you'll have an entirely different perspective of what happened on January 6th. It's not what you've been told. All the lawyers that are involved and have seen the discovery, we don't believe this nonsense. And Daniel, I apologize, I guess, on behalf of half the American public, for sure, that you ever had to go through this. And I certainly think an apology from the United States government is due to everybody that suffered through the prosecutions from January 6th. So I appreciate having you on the podcast In Defense of Freedom. As I mentioned, the podcast is a product of the California Constitutional Rights Foundation. We've been around for 7 years. We were very active during the COVID period, and we've been active in defense of January 6th defendants and supporting families. We look forward to any help that can be given. We encourage you to go to our website at www.cacrf.org, and you can make a contribution, and you can certainly see what the foundation has been doing over the last 7 years. We certainly appreciate, Daniel, you being on the podcast today. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much.